Close your eyes. Let your body sink slowly into whatever is holding you right now. Feel the weight of the day begin to dissolve, like salt dissolving in warm water. Tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere far away, far from the noise of the modern world, back to a time of gas-lit lanterns, of steam and velvet, of silver candlesticks and the faint perfume of old leather and wood smoke. A time when the ocean crossing between Europe and America took days instead of hours. A time when a single telegram could change everything. And a time when one man, a man of impossible charm, impossible cunning, and an impossible smile, moved through the world like a ghost that no one could catch, and no one truly wanted to. His name was Arsène Lupin, and this is his story. Picture a great ocean liner. She is called La Provençale, and she is extraordinary. She sits on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean like a floating palace, long and proud and magnificent, her black hull cutting slowly through steel-gray water, her tall smokestacks breathing lazy columns of white steam into the evening sky. Inside, she is nothing short of magnificent. Her grand saloon is draped in crimson carpets so thick that the heels of fine shoes make no sound upon them. Crystal chandeliers hang from the painted ceilings, swaying ever so gently with the rhythm of the waves, catching the candlelight and scattering it in 1,000 directions, like captured stars. The air smells of Cuban cigars, of Parisian perfume, of the faint saltiness of the sea that somehow finds its way through even the most sealed portholes. Tonight, on the second evening of the voyage from Le Havre to New York, the first-class passengers have gathered in the saloon for dinner. There are counts and countesses. There are American industrialists with thick gold pocket watches and louder voices. There are actresses whose names appear in the newspapers of 3 countries. There are diamond merchants who keep their fortunes pressed close against their chests, even in sleep. And there is a young Frenchman by the name of Monsieur Bernard d'Andrézy. He is perhaps 28 years old. He is slim, impeccably dressed in a dark evening coat, his cravat tied with the precision of a man who has learned that elegance is a form of armor. His eyes are pale, gray perhaps, or the color of a winter sea, and they move with a quiet intelligence that most people, looking at his easy smile and his graceful manner, never notice at all. He is charming, terribly, effortlessly charming. He has been making the journey most pleasant for a young American woman by the name of Miss Nellie, who travels with her wealthy aunt, Lady Gerlande, a formidable English woman of considerable fortune and considerably firm opinions. Miss Nellie is delightful. She has dark eyes full of curiosity, and she laughs at d'Andrézy's observations about the other passengers with a brightness that makes the chandeliers seem dim by comparison. On this particular evening, they stand together at the railing of the promenade deck. The sea has grown restless. The wind has picked up, tugging at the hem of Nellie's traveling coat, pulling a strand of her dark hair loose from its pin. She holds her hat with one gloved hand and watches the waves rise and fall in the darkness below. She says softly, "Do you think it's true? Do you really think he's on board?" d'Andrézy lights a cigarette with a single practiced motion, the small flame guttering in the wind before catching. He exhales slowly, watching the smoke disappear into the dark air. "Do I think who is on board?" he asks, with the voice of a man who already knows the answer and finds the entire situation quietly, privately amusing. "Lupin," she says. "Arsène Lupin." She says the name the way everyone says it, half afraid, half fascinated. as though the word itself carries some electricity. D'Andrésy turns to look at her. A smile crosses his lips, slow, warm, slightly dangerous. "Ah," he says, "Lupin." He takes another slow draw of his cigarette. "Well," he says, "even if he were on board, what would you have to fear? He doesn't hurt beautiful women. He only steals from those who have too much already, and he leaves his calling card as a courtesy. I find it rather considerate, don't you?" She stares at him. "Considerate? He's a criminal." "He's an artist," D'Andrésy says softly. "There's a difference." Earlier that day, the telegram had arrived. It had come crackling over the wireless, addressed to the ship's captain, a serious, gray-bearded man named Dumont, who ran his vessel with naval precision. The telegram was brief. It read, "Arsène Lupin believed aboard your vessel. First class. Blonde hair. Wound on right forearm. Traveling under assumed name beginning with the letter R. Proceed with caution." And then the signal had gone dead. A lightning strike, perhaps, or something else entirely. The name, the full name, had never come through. Only the letter R. The captain had quietly shared the telegram with his first officer, who had quietly shared it with the head steward, who had not shared it quietly at all. Within 2 hours, every passenger in first class knew. The elegant stillness of the saloon had developed a new quality, a watchfulness, a faint electric tension that ran beneath the polished surface of every conversation, like a cold current beneath warm water. Every man was suddenly a suspect. The Russian diplomat, Count Rozovsky, with his silver hair and his heavy rings. The Italian attaché, Signor Rivera, whose accent was perhaps a shade too perfect. The American trader named Renfrew, who drank too much but whose eyes were always sharp. And there were others. Luggage was quietly inspected. Conversations became careful. Smiles became harder to read. But no one, not the captain, not the officers, not the increasingly anxious head of ship security, thought to look too carefully at the elegant young Frenchman with the winter-gray eyes. Why would they? He was helping them search. In fact, he had suggested 3 hiding places on the ship that none of the officers had thought to check. He had examined door locks with a jeweler's loop he produced from his breast pocket. He had theorized aloud, brilliantly and convincingly, about the kind of man Lupin must be, his habits, his psychology, his likely movements through the ship. He had been, in short, invaluable. And in the evenings, he had danced with Miss Nellie and made her laugh, and told her that the whole situation was nothing at all to worry about. And she had believed him, because he was very, very good at being believed. The theft happened on the 3rd night. Lady Gerlande, Miss Nellie's aunt, possessed something extraordinary. It was a necklace. Not merely beautiful, though it was that. It was a piece of history, a cascade of diamonds and deep Burmese rubies set in platinum, the stones themselves having once adorned the throat of a noblewoman at the court of the last French emperor. Its value was estimated at 500,000 francs. She kept it in a lacquered jewelry box, locked with a small brass key that never left her person. The key slept in her bedside drawer. The room was locked from the inside. The porthole was bolted. There was no possible way in. And yet, in the morning, Lady Gerlande's voice tore through the calm of the ship like a blade through silk. The necklace was gone. The captain arrived. The security officers arrived. Even D'Andrésy arrived, his pale eyes moving carefully over every surface. The jewelry box sat on the dressing table, locked, undamaged. The key was still in the bedside drawer. The room was still locked from the inside. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been forced. and in the place where the necklace had lain, on its bed of black velvet inside the locked box, there was a single, small white card, written in a flowing, elegant hand, with the compliments of A.L. The saloon erupted. Passengers who had been playing cards stopped playing. Women clutched their jewel cases. Men checked their pocket watches and then checked them again. The captain ordered a full search of every first-class cabin. Every bag was opened. Every coat pocket was turned out. Every loose panel and hidden space the crew could think of was examined. Nothing. The necklace had vanished as completely as if it had been dissolved into the sea air. D'Andresi moved through the search with quiet efficiency, his expression grave and helpful. He crouched beside Lady Gerland's porthole and peered at its outer edge through his small loop. "Look here," he said to the captain, pointing to a faint scratch in the painted metal. "He came in from outside, climbed the exterior hull in the storm. An acrobat, this man, a remarkable physical specimen." The captain frowned. "In that weather? The waves were 12 feet. Which," D'Andresi said, rising smoothly and brushing invisible dust from his knee, "is precisely why no one was watching the outside of the ship." The captain stared at him with something approaching respect. "You have the mind of a detective, monsieur." D'Andresi smiled. "I've simply read too many detective novels," he said. The last night of the voyage arrived. A farewell dinner was held in the Grand Saloon. The tension had not dissolved. It had merely dressed itself in evening clothes. Nellie sat beside D'Andresi at dinner, and she watched him in a way she had not quite watched him before. His right arm, she noticed, was wrapped in a thin bandage just below the elbow. She had not seen it before. "What happened to your arm?" she asked, keeping her voice light. He glanced down at it as though he had almost forgotten it was there. "A scratch," he said easily. "Caught it on an iron door handle during the storm. Clumsy of me." She nodded slowly, but something moved through her mind, cold and quiet as a tide coming in. A wound on the right forearm. She looked at his hair. In the warm light of the chandeliers, the light she had been sitting beneath for 3 evenings without truly examining, his hair was not quite dark. It was the color of autumn wheat, blonde. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time she saw what was truly there. Not the warmth, not the easy charm. Something underneath. Something ancient and amused and impossibly calm. The eyes of a man who has never in his entire life been frightened. He looked back at her, and he knew that she knew. He raised his wine glass slowly, holding her gaze. He smiled, that same smile. But now it meant something different. It said, "Well, there it is." And then he turned away to answer something the gentleman on his left had said, as though nothing at all had happened. As though she had simply seen a magician's trick from the wrong angle. As though the illusion, once broken, was still somehow the most beautiful thing in the room. 3 weeks after the ship docked in New York, after the handcuffs had been snapped onto his wrists on the pier by a short, sharp-eyed inspector named Ganimard, a man who had been hunting Arsène Lupin for 7 years and had finally caught him. The most famous thief in France was delivered to the prison of La Santé in Paris. La Santé. It was not a pleasant place. It was built of gray stone, the kind of gray that has never been warm, the kind that absorbs cold and holds it through every season. Its walls were thick enough to swallow sound. Its corridors smelled of damp stone and iron and the specific hopelessness of confinement. It had broken harder men than Arsène Lupin, or so it believed. Cell 14 was at the end of the east corridor on the 2nd level, behind a door of reinforced iron with a small barred window set too high to see through comfortably. Within 2 days of Lupin's arrival, the cell had been furnished, by his own inexplicable means, with a second blanket, a small oil lamp, and a stack of philosophy books. Within a week, there were fresh flowers on the window ledge. Within a fortnight, the cell smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. No one could explain where any of it had come from. The warden, a heavy-set, perpetually furious man named Baron Cahorn, had the guards changed every 2 hours. He had the cell searched every day. He had Lupin's mail read before it was delivered and his food tasted before it was served. He was taking no chances. "If this man escapes," he told Inspector Ganimard on one of Ganimard's regular visits, "I will hang myself, and then I will come back from the dead and hang you." Ganimard nodded serenely. "He won't escape," he said. "I put those handcuffs on myself." But the newspapers were already making Lupin famous in a way that made Cahorn grind his teeth. Every few days, another story appeared, reporting on his wit, his elegance, his inexplicable good humor behind bars. Letters arrived from women all over France, addressed to him in care of the prison. The warden confiscated all of them and burned them in his office fireplace, which helped his temper not at all. And then, 6 weeks before the trial, a letter appeared in one of the Paris newspapers. It was short. It was signed, Arsène Lupin. It had been smuggled out of La Santé by a method that remained entirely mysterious. It read, "To the Honorable President of the Court, I regret to inform you that I will be unable to attend my trial on the 14th of April, as I have a prior engagement, a dinner reservation at Maxime's on the same evening. I apologize for any inconvenience and will forward my new address in due course. Yours most sincerely, Arsène Lupin." Paris laughed. The Baron of La Santé did not. Ganimard came. He descended the stone stairs to cell 14 and found Lupin lying on his cot, reading, his legs crossed at the ankle, entirely at his ease. "You wrote that letter?" Ganimard said without preamble. Lupin looked up over the top of his book. "I write many letters," he said pleasantly. "I find correspondence keeps the mind alive." "How did it get out?" Lupin turned a page. He moved slowly through the long main corridor, his shoulders hunched, his steps the unsteady steps of a man who is tired and old and cold. The guards watched him pass with eyes full of contempt and barely contained amusement. He reached the heavy iron gates. The duty guard, without a word, turned the key. The gate opened. The cold night air of Paris rushed in, sharp and clean and tasting of the river and of freedom. The old vagrant shuffled out into the darkness. The gate clanged shut behind him. He walked 50 meters down the street, turned the corner into a narrow side lane, and stopped. In the shadow of the lane, a small black carriage waited, its horse standing perfectly still, breath steaming in the cold air. And something extraordinary happened. The old man's back straightened, completely, instantly, like a puppet whose strings have been gathered back up. The shuffling walk became something else entirely, something precise and graceful and unhurried. A hand reached into a coat pocket and produced a white handkerchief. It was raised to the face, and when it came away, the gray stubble, the careful, painstakingly applied gray stubble, was gone. The eyes that looked up at the Paris sky were pale as winter water, and alive, and amused. Arsène Lupin adjusted his coat. He looked back once in the direction of the prison walls that stood dark against the night sky. He smiled. He had not escaped from La Santé. He had become Baudru, slowly, carefully, over weeks of controlled near-starvation and chemical skin treatments, and acting of a quality that would have brought the Comédie Française to its feet. He had made them believe that Lupin had vanished and left a vagrant behind. And then he had made them so embarrassed by their own failure that they had opened the front door themselves and sent him politely away. Just as he had promised Ganimard. Through the front door, guards holding it open, wishing him good morning. Well, good evening in the event. He stepped into the carriage. "Maxime's," he told the driver. "I have a dinner to attend. I told the judge I would, and I am, above all things, a man of his word." He reached into his inside breast pocket and produced a small envelope. He addressed it in the carriage by the light of the lamp. Inspector Ganimard, 36, Quai des Orfèvres, Paris. Inside the envelope, he placed a gold pocket watch and a small card. It read, "Thank you for opening the door. A debt paid is a debt honored. B. Formerly." The coast of Normandy. Let me describe it to you, because it deserves to be described. It is a coast of white cliffs, chalk cliffs, that rise sheer and brilliant from the gray-green water of the English Channel, their faces turned to the sea with a kind of stoic pride that has nothing to do with human affairs at all. The sea below them is cold and clear, and on calm days it turns a pale, extraordinary shade of blue-green that seems lit from within. The village of Étretat sits quietly among these cliffs. It is small, a church with a steeple, fishermen's houses painted white and cream, nets drying in the wind. The smell of salt and seaweed and bread from the baker who opens at 6. And offshore, standing in the water not far from the base of the great cliff called the Falaise d'Aval, there is a rock. It is an extraordinary rock. It rises from the water in a single narrow spike, its tip piercing the sky like an enormous needle threading itself through the clouds. The fishermen call it l'aiguille, the needle. It has stood there as long as anyone can remember. It has stood there longer than the village, longer than France. No one thinks about it very much, which is exactly how it wants things. Arsène Lupin arrived in Étretat 3 weeks after walking out of La Santé. He came not as himself, naturally. He was an old painter, a somewhat eccentric elderly gentleman named Monsieur Valneras, who wore a battered hat, carried an easel, and spent his mornings sitting on the shingle beach making watercolor studies of the cliffs. He was not, in truth, a very good watercolorist. But no one expected elderly eccentric painters to be very good at watercolors, and so no one looked twice. What they could not see was what he was doing with his afternoons. He was reading. Not novels, not philosophy. He had brought with him, smuggled from a library in Paris inside the hollow wooden frame of his easel, a collection of documents. Old documents. Some of them were centuries old. There were letters in Latin. There were architectural sketches, old, precise, drawn with the certainty of craftsmen who built things to last. There was a fragment of a map, incomplete, with one corner torn away. And there were several pages in a handwriting he had come to recognize. The handwriting of a man who had lived 400 years ago, who had known where the kings of France hid their most secret things. The map pointed to the needle, not around it, not toward it, into it, because the needle was hollow. The fishing village also had another visitor that week. He arrived on the Tuesday. He came by motor car from the direction of Fécamp, a long, lean Englishman with a face like a well-worn blade, sharp at every edge, with eyes of a peculiar pale brown that noticed everything they looked at with a kind of instinctive categorization, as though the world were a text he was perpetually, silently editing. He wore a long coat. He smoked a pipe. He took a room at the Hotel Blanquette and paid a week in advance, in cash, without being asked. His name, he said, was Mr. Herlock Sholmes. He had come from London at the request of a local baron named d'Imbleval, who owned a large estate a few kilometers inland, and who had recently received a letter, unsigned, but written in a style that was instantly recognizable to anyone who had been following the newspapers, suggesting that his collection of Renaissance bronzes might not be entirely safe. Sholmes had not come for the bronzes. He had come because a problem he could not solve was an affront to the natural order, and Arsène Lupin was, in Sholmes's privately held view, the most interesting unsolved problem in Europe. On the morning of their first encounter, the air was gray and still, and the sea lay flat and colorless like hammered tin. The old painter was setting up his easel on the beach when the Englishman came walking along the tide line, moving with the economical, undecorated stride of a man who walks to think. He stopped. He looked at the painter for a moment. Then he continued, then stopped again. He turned back. He walked to within 10 feet of the easel and stood there, hands in his coat pockets, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. The old painter went on laying washes of gray over his sketch of the cliffs, apparently oblivious. Then the Englishman said, quite conversationally, "Good morning. Painting the cliffs, are we?" The painter looked up with the mild, slightly unfocused expression of a man interrupted in a pleasant reverie. "I am attempting to," he said, in the wavering, slightly breathless voice of an elderly man. "Not with conspicuous success, I'm afraid. The light does not cooperate today." "No," said the Englishman. "It doesn't." A pause. "Your shoes," he said then. The painter blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Your shoes are muddy to the left heel only. The mud is red clay, not from this beach, which is pure chalk shingle. Red clay is found on the coastal path above the Vallées d'Antifer, a path that requires a certain agility to descend, particularly in the dark, which is presumably when you were there." The old painter did not move. "Furthermore," the Englishman continued, in the same unhurried tone, "the adhesive used to attach false facial hair of the type you are currently wearing has a very particular smell, a mixture of spirit gum and something floral, possibly violet. It is a smell I have encountered once before, in a Parisian theatrical supply house. I have a catalogue of approximately 4,000 smells committed to memory. This one is number 237. A long silence. The sea moved against the stones. A gull called somewhere above the cliff. Then the old painter began to laugh. A low, genuine, delighted laugh that was nothing at all like the voice that had produced it, and reached up and peeled the gray beard from his face in a single, smooth motion. The winter-gray eyes caught the flat morning light. "My God," said Arsène Lupin, "you are extraordinary." "And you," said Herlock Sholmes, drawing a revolver from his coat pocket with no particular urgency, "are under arrest. The French police are approximately 20 minutes behind me." Lupin looked at the gun. He looked at the Englishman. He looked at the needle, standing in the still gray water a quarter of a mile offshore. "The arrest," he said pleasantly, "I respectfully decline. But the observation about the shoes, genuinely impressive. No one has ever gotten that far before." "I am rarely stopped before the end," Sholmes said. "No," Lupin agreed. "I don't imagine you are." He took a step back, toward the cliff edge. Sholmes raised the revolver slightly. "Don't," he said. "I'll tell you something," Lupin said. "You've come looking for a thief. I've come looking for a kingdom. Those are very different things." Another step back. The cliff edge was perhaps 3 meters behind him. Below, 50 meters of white chalk face, falling straight down to where the sea sucked and breathed around the rocks. "Lupin," Sholmes said. "We'll meet again," Lupin said. "Sooner than you think." And he stepped off the cliff. Sholmes crossed the distance in 4 strides and looked over the edge. No body, no splash, no sound except the sea. And then, 20 meters below, where no man should have been able to survive, he saw it. A fishing net stretched across a natural ledge in the cliff face, camouflaged with chalk dust and dried seaweed, almost invisible against the white rock. And in the cliff face beside it, a crack, small, barely large enough to admit a man. "Clever," Sholmes said, to no one in particular. He stood for a moment, looking at the needle standing in the gray water. Then he turned and walked back toward the village with the same unhurried, economical stride. He had his own ideas about how to enter the needle, and they did not involve climbing down cliff faces on fishing nets, which he considered unnecessarily theatrical. Inside the rock, Lupin ran. The interior passage was narrow, barely shoulder-width, and wound upward in a long, slow spiral, the walls pressing close on either side, the darkness complete except for the small torch he carried. The stone was cold and damp, the kind of damp that has existed for centuries, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed strangely, as though the rock were thinking. He climbed. The passage opened, eventually, into a chamber. It was at the very top of the needle, inside the tip, which from the outside appeared solid stone but was in fact a small, sealed vault, its ceiling perhaps 15 feet above the floor. He raised his torch. He stood very still for a moment. He had read the documents. He had translated the Latin. He had studied the architectural drawings. He had believed, intellectually, that the chamber existed, and that it contained what the documents claimed it contained. But believing something and standing inside it are 2 very different things. The chamber was full. Not cluttered, full in the way that a carefully packed archive is full. Along the curved walls, stacked in precise order, were wooden chests, their oak blackened with age, their brass fittings green. On a stone shelf carved directly from the rock, objects of gold, candlesticks, a scepter, objects whose purpose he could not immediately identify, but whose age he could feel. In the center of the floor, on a low stone plinth, a crown, not large, not ostentatious, simple, magnificent, medieval, set with 7 stones, 4 white diamonds and 3 sapphires, arranged in alternating sequence around the band. He recognized it from a manuscript drawing he had studied 6 months ago in a private library in Rouen. It was the crown of a king of France who had died 700 years ago, and whose crown had been recorded as missing since the 14th century. He was standing in the treasury of France's hidden kings. He stood there for a long time, in the silence and the torchlight, and he felt something he did not feel very often, something close to awe. And then he heard a sound, a soft sound, a careful sound, the sound of a man who moves very precisely, very quietly, and believes himself to be unheard. He turned. Herlock Sholmes stood at the entrance to the chamber. His pistol was raised. His expression was one of absolute calm. "You found the air current," Lupin said. "I found the air current," Sholmes agreed. "The seabirds avoid a particular crack in the rock's base. An air current repels them. Where there is an air current inside a solid rock, there is a hollow. Where there is a hollow, there is an entrance. Straightforward." "For you," Lupin said. "For me," Sholmes agreed. They looked at each other across the torchlit space, across 7 centuries of accumulated treasure. "Put it down," Sholmes said, gesturing to the torch. "Both hands where I can see them." Lupin set the torch in a wall bracket. He put his hands in his pockets. He said, "You could shoot me. You could take the treasure and hand it to the French government. You would be celebrated. Books would be written. Your name, which I'm told is already fairly well known, would become synonymous with the greatest discovery of the century. Sholmes waited. But, Lupin said pleasantly, you would have a problem. Would I? The door I entered through. The mechanism is old, Roman, very clever. It locks from the inside automatically when it is triggered from outside, which it was when you came through. Sholmes's eyes moved to the entrance behind him. The passage was closed. A stone slab, perfectly fitted, perfectly balanced, had settled silently into place. The only way to open it from the inside, Lupin said, is to know a sequence of pressure points on the wall, a code of sorts. I know it. You do not. He spread his hands slightly. Kill me, he said, and you become a mummy. A very famous mummy, but a mummy nonetheless. A very long silence. The torch crackled softly. Somewhere far below, muffled by 50 meters of solid chalk, the sea moved. Sholmes slowly lowered the pistol a fraction. His jaw tightened. You planned this, he said. I planned several outcomes, Lupin said. This was my second preference, to be honest. I had hoped to avoid involving you at all, but here we are. Another silence. And then the chamber shook. It was not dramatic at first, a trembling, a soft groan from somewhere deep in the rock. Then a second tremor, larger, and from above them a single stone fell, striking the floor between them and shattering. Sholmes looked up at the ceiling. Lupin looked at his watch. Ganimard, he said, and the police. They had dynamite. I underestimated how quickly they would give up looking for the entrance and start making one. He looked at Sholmes. We have perhaps 3 minutes before this ceiling comes down. Another tremor. 2 more stones fell. Dust. Sholmes put his gun in his pocket. Tell me what you need, he said. The wheel, Lupin said. The stone wheel on the west wall. You see it? Sholmes moved. The wheel was large, perhaps 4 feet across, set flush in the wall and so perfectly balanced that it turned, despite its apparent weight, with only moderate effort. On my count, Lupin said, his hands moving over a sequence of stones on the opposite wall. 3, 2, 1, now. They worked together with the precision of men who have no interest in dying. The stone walls around them groaned. The floor shifted. Dust fell in streams from above. The wheel turned. Lupin pressed the sequence. A crack. A rush of cold, salt-heavy air. A second passage, lower than the first, descending steeply toward the sound of water. Go, Lupin said. They ran. The passage was tight and wet, the floor slick with moisture that had seeped through the rock over centuries. Behind them, with a deep and final sound, the chamber collapsed. They burst through the end of the passage into open air, a small, natural opening in the rock face at sea level, where the tidal water was knee-deep and very cold. A small boat was wedged in a crevice of rock, flat-bottomed, oars shipped, waiting. Lupin stepped into it and looked back at Sholmes, who stood in the cold water at the passage mouth. Come, Lupin said. Sholmes looked at the boat. He looked at the collapsing needle. Sections of its upper face were sliding into the water now with sounds like cannon shots, sending white plumes of foam 20 feet into the air. He looked to the direction of the shore. He could reach it. Probably. Swimming in a heavy overcoat in cold water with the sea disturbed by the collapse was not ideal, but the alternative was accepting passage in a thief's boat. Herlock Sholmes had principles. He said, Our roads end here, Lupin. I represent the law. I don't ride in the boats of men who stand outside it." He reached up and removed his hat. He held it up, a simple gesture across 5 feet of cold water, between 2 extraordinary men. "Well played," he said, and he turned and waded toward the shore, into the rolling white water, his coat billowing out around him. Lupin watched him go. He felt something he could not quite name, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold water or the cold air. He pushed the boat off from the rock. He looked up. The last section of the needle, the very tip, the point of the needle, turned slowly, gracefully, and fell into the sea. 7 centuries of hidden treasure descended beneath the white foam and the cold gray-green water, and were gone. Lupin sat for a moment in the bobbing boat, listening to the silence that followed. He reached into his coat pocket. His fingers found what they were looking for. He drew it out. It was small and black, and perfectly round. A pearl. A single black pearl, taken not from the royal treasury, which was now buried forever under 50 feet of water and chalk rubble, but from a smaller chest he had opened first, a chest he had found with his hand in the darkness before Sholmes arrived. 1 pearl, worth perhaps a very great deal, worth certainly a great deal less than the treasury he had lost. He held it up against the gray sky, rolling it between his fingers. He smiled. 1, he said quietly. 1 is enough. He rowed. The shore grew closer. Somewhere behind him, he could hear Sholmes, dripping and dignified, being helped out of the water by the Normandy fishermen who had come running when the needle fell. He did not look back. Ahead of him, a white yacht sat at anchor in the deeper water of the bay, its sails furled, its crew ready. He pulled toward it. He was not finished. He was never finished. But for now, for this quiet morning on the Normandy coast, with the chalk dust still settling on the gray water and the sound of the sea filling the world, for now, he was content. The Château de Gesvres stood on the bank of the Seine, 30 kilometers southeast of Paris, lit from every window. It was the 3rd of November. The Count had spent 11,000 francs on this evening's entertainment, and the 11,000 francs were visible. The gravel drive was lined with torches. The front facade was illuminated by a row of gas lamps that turned the pale stone warm gold against the November dark. The windows blazed. Music, a full orchestra, 40 musicians, drifted through those windows and out across the lawns and down to the river, where it dissolved into the sound of water. The guests were extraordinary. Venetian masks, white, ivory, gold, black, painted with flowers and peacock feathers and intricate geometric patterns, silk in every color. The jewels on display represented the savings of entire generations. It was, in every sense, a perfect night for someone who should not have been there. He arrived at 20 minutes past 9. He came in a private carriage that stopped at the far end of the drive, not at the entrance, and he stepped out alone, adjusting the sleeves of his coat before walking toward the light. He wore the costume of a 17th-century French duke, black, with a silver-gray sash and a half-mask of black silk that covered his eyes and the bridge of his nose. It suited him. He moved through the guests with the ease of a man entirely at home in rooms like this, which he was, in every sense that mattered. He had not come to steal. He had come because of a letter. The letter had arrived at his current address, an address that essentially no one alive was supposed to know, 3 days earlier. It was written in red ink, on paper that smelled of roses. It read simply, "We should talk. Come to the Gesvres ball on the 3rd. I will find you. J." J. He had looked at that initial for a long time. Only one person he knew signed their name with a single letter in red ink on rose-scented paper. Josephine. Josephine de Beaumont, known by various names in various cities, known best by the title the newspapers had given her 10 years ago, the Countess Cagliostro. She had been his teacher once, long ago, before he was who he was. She had taught him languages and locks, and how to read a room, and how to read a face, and how to be invisible in a crowded place. She had also, on 2 separate occasions, tried to have him killed. Both times because he was better than she was, and she could not forgive it. He found her at 9:25, standing on the balcony that overlooked the river. She was wearing red. She was always wearing red. A gown of deep crimson velvet, cut in the style of the Second Empire, nipped at the waist and sweeping at the hem. A mask of red silk set with stones that might have been rubies or might have been glass. With her, the difference was rarely worth betting on. Her hair was black. Her skin was white. She did not look like a woman who had been causing mayhem across 3 continents for 20 years. She looked like a painting. He stepped up beside her and looked out at the dark river. "You haven't aged a day," he said. She turned to look at him without surprise, as though she had known exactly when he would arrive. "And you," she said, "still look like a boy who thinks he knows everything." "I know enough," he said. "The pearl," she said. He looked at her sideways. "What about it?" "The black pearl from the needle. You still have it?" "I have many things." "The pearl is not a jewel," she said. "It is a document. There is a hollow at its core. Inside the hollow, a cipher. The cipher, properly decoded, gives the names of 7 men, men currently in positions of considerable power in the French government, who have been taking money from foreign interests for 11 years. The man who holds that list holds those 7 men. Silence. The river moved below them, dark and indifferent. "I want it," she said. "I know you do." "Give it to me, and I will give you something of equal value." "What could you possibly offer me that I would want?" She smiled, and the smile was, as it had always been, the most dangerous thing in any room. "Information," she said, "about your mother." He went very still. Of all the weapons she had ever pointed at him, that was the sharpest. "My mother has been dead for 15 years, he said. His voice was careful, empty, a voice that gave nothing away. "Has she?" the Countess said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the patient, satisfied expression of a woman who has just played the card she has been holding all evening. "Give me the pearl," she said softly, "and I will tell you everything." He was quiet for a long moment. The orchestra inside had moved from the waltz to something slower, something that drifted out through the tall windows like smoke, like a question without an answer. Then he said, "I need 10 minutes. "You have 5, she said. He walked back inside. He moved through the crowd, and then, very carefully, very slowly, he began to look. He had felt it when he walked in, that particular quality of attention directed at him, the kind that tries to disguise itself as inattention and never quite succeeds. There, by the east doors, a man in a harlequin costume, his movements too regular, too watchful, facing slightly too consistently toward the room's interior. And there, by the musicians, a woman in a gray domino mask, her attention fixed on a point that happened to be him. And there, and there, and there. 7 of them, perhaps 8. Not guests, agents. The Countess had not come to negotiate. she had come to collect. He understood it now. The red letter, the specific choice of venue, the private conversation on the balcony while her people quietly closed off the exits. She had sold him to the authorities, or to someone who functioned like the authorities, in exchange for whatever immunity she needed. He was surrounded. The music played. The candles burned. 500 people danced and drank and talked without the faintest idea of what was happening in their midst. He walked back to the balcony. She was still there. 5 minutes, she said. 2 things, he said. 1. No. 2. She raised an eyebrow above the rim of her mask. First, he said, the pearl. He reached into his coat. He produced the pearl. He held it between his thumb and forefinger in the light. She reached for it. And second, he said pleasantly, I need your help getting out of a room. You're not getting out, she said. It's done. Give me the pearl and accept it gracefully. I never accept anything ungracefully, he said. And with a movement so fast and so unexpected that she actually made a sound, half laugh, half exclamation, he pulled her onto the dance floor. The orchestra was playing a Viennese waltz. He danced. God help her, she danced. He held her hand and held her waist, and they moved through the room with the precision and the lightness of 2 people who have, whatever else has passed between them, always known how to dance together. The agents along the walls moved toward them. Couldn't shoot. She was between them and him. Couldn't close in. He kept moving, kept turning, kept placing her between himself and every angle. The guests parted around them, enchanted or alarmed. He spoke to her quietly as they turned. The pearl, he said, is in my left coat pocket. The same coat I was wearing when your harlequin friend by the east door brushed against me on my way to the balcony. She frowned. Which means, he continued, still dancing, still smiling, that he has already taken it from me. Which means that when you check your people in 10 minutes, you will discover that one of them, probably the one you trust most, has a pearl of considerable value in his possession. She stared at him. It isn't the real one, by the way, he said. I switched it in the carriage on the way here. The real pearl is in a bank vault in Geneva. But your man doesn't know that. And now he does have something that looks exactly like it, which will make for a very interesting conversation. He spun her. She came back to him and hissed in his ear. You? Yes, he agreed. Now, on my count. 1, 2. He stepped back from her, bowed, reached into his sleeve and produced a small object no larger than a walnut. He threw it upward into the crystal chandelier above them. The world went white. A flash of magnesium powder, the kind photographers use, enormously concentrated, detonated against the chandelier's heat. The light was blinding. For 3 full seconds, the room contained nothing but white and the sound of 500 people's surprise. And then it cleared. Lupin was gone. The Countess stood in the center of the dance floor, alone, her red mask slightly askew. The agents were shouting, running for doors. Inspector Ganimard, because of course it was Ganimard. It was always Ganimard, standing by the north door with his hat pulled low and his reliable, indestructible fury, threw open the balcony doors and ran to the railing above the Seine. He shone his lamp out over the water. A figure stood at the stone parapet above the river. The black coat, the silver sash, the mask was gone. The face was Lupin's. He raised one hand in the familiar salute. He bowed, low, theatrical, the bow of an actor who knows the audience loves him even when they hate him. Then he looked at the Countess,
still standing in the center of the room, surrounded by her useless agents, and called out in a voice designed to carry, "The pearl, by the way, is already in the Louvre. I donated it this morning, anonymously, along with documentation of the 7 gentlemen whose names are inside it." A beat. "You're welcome, France." And he went over the railing. Ganimard's lamp caught him in midair, arms out, coat spread wide, and then the darkness swallowed him and there was only the sound of the river. They searched for 2 hours. They found his coat, washed up on the bank 300 meters downstream. They found his mask, floating in a pool of lamplight by the bridge. They found nothing else. In the morning, the newspapers were divided between 2 stories. The first was the disappearance, presumed death, of France's most famous criminal. The second was the scandal in the government, sparked by an anonymous package delivered to the Interior Ministry containing a decoded cipher and 7 names. Paris talked of nothing else for 3 weeks, and in a small village in the Loire Valley, a village with no name worth mentioning, a village of old stone houses and slow water and an excellent bakery, a man lived quietly. He kept a small garden. He grew roses, not as many as he would have liked, but roses all the same.
He sat in the morning on a wooden chair in the garden, drinking coffee that was remarkably good for such a quiet place, and reading the newspaper. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 40, in the way of men whose age is somehow always slightly uncertain. He had gray eyes. He smiled easily. On the table beside his coffee cup, serving as a paperweight for the pages that lifted in the light morning breeze, sat a small, dark object. Round, black, perfect. Not the cipher, not the document, not the information, just the pearl itself. The empty shell, the hollow center cleaned out, its contents already dispersed, already in the hands of people who would do something about them. Just the pearl. Because it was beautiful. Because he had carried it a long way, over water and through dark passages and across a dance floor and through the cold air above a river. Because some things deserve to be kept simply for their own sake. He folded the newspaper. He looked up at the sky, blue today, pale and clear, the kind of sky that asks nothing of anyone. He exhaled slowly. He picked up his coffee. He listened to the birds. He said to no one in particular, in a voice that was barely more than a murmur, "That will do for now." And he went back to his garden. And so the legend rested, for a little while. The police went on, as police do, writing reports, reviewing files, replacing certainties with question marks. Inspector Ganimard retired the following spring. He kept on his mantelpiece a single gold pocket watch engraved with the initials A.L. He never told anyone where it came from. Lady Gerland's necklace was eventually discovered, anonymously returned, in a plain wooden box to a Paris auction house with a note attached that read only, "For the benefit of the widows of French sailors, please be so good as to arrange this." And Miss Nellie, who had stood on a pier in New York in November with her aunt's camera heavy around her neck and tears she could not entirely account for standing in her eyes. Miss Nellie opened the camera that evening in her hotel room and found what she found. She sat with it in her hand for a long time. Then she closed her fingers around it. She said nothing. She told no one. And she never quite smiled the same way again. Not the same ordinary smile, the polite, social smile. It was a different smile now. Something a little sadder and a little more knowing, and a little more alive. The smile of someone who has met the most interesting person in the world and let them go. As for the man in the garden in the Loire Valley, he tended his roses. He drank his coffee. He read his newspapers. And sometimes, on evenings when the light was particularly beautiful, golden and long across the garden, catching the roses and the old stone walls and the distant curve of the river. He would sit very still and think about all of it. The ship, the prison, the white cliffs, the treasury at the top of the world, the dance, the river. And he would smile, that particular smile, the one that was always half a secret, and say nothing at all. Because the best stories, he had always believed, are the ones that end quietly, not with a bang or a chase or a final confrontation, but with a garden and coffee and morning light. And the knowledge, private and complete and entirely sufficient, that you lived. Good night. Sleep well.